I'm recording it, so I'll put it on YouTube. If you want to hear it again later, then I'll post the YouTube video into the Turners Facebook group. So this is your talking bit, which goes with your Whirling Dervish training, and it's both a chance to process the training, because as you know you're not allowed to talk in the lessons, and also to ask any questions or voice anything you want to voice. And from my part, I'm leading up to give you a description of the symbolism of the macabre, or the ceremony. But on the way to that, there's quite a few things I have to do some groundwork on first. And one of them, which is tonight's talk, I'm going to put the whole training here in the context of the society here. So I'm going to give the history of the society and what it's about, and how the Mevlevi dervishes in Colet House fit within the context of Colet House. It's sort of so you know what the society is and what the society isn't, and that will help you understand the way we do it. And then after that, next week, I'll lead on to the basic philosophy that underlies all the world's mystical traditions, which is a philosophy known as non-dualism. And I'll draw in different traditions on that. I'll use partly Indian Advaita, partly Rumi, and various other of the world's wisdom traditions, because most of you come from different traditions and come from different backgrounds, and everyone has their own particular route to the realization of their true nature. So what's right for me and what I've understood may be totally wrong for you. So you're going to find, or will have found, your own path. And just to illustrate that, I'm just going to read you something the American mythologist Joseph Campbell said. And he said, "You enter the forest at the darkest point where there is no path. Where there's a way or a path, it is someone else's path. Each human being is a unique phenomenon. The idea is to find your own pathway to bliss." So, bearing that in mind, in my talks, don't believe a word I say. Absolutely don't. It's vital that everything comes out of your own experience. So I'm only basically talking from my experience and telling you a bit about the traditions. But if it resonates with you, that's all well and good. If it doesn't resonate with you, that's absolutely how it should be. And always listen primarily to your own inner voice, because that tells you exactly what you need to know, whereas I personally don't know what you need to know. So, any questions about that? Okay, no questions. Questions will emerge as we progress, because I absolutely thrive on questions, because when you ask a question I know what to talk about, whereas if not I might just be sort of waffling out into the air. But so first I'm going to give you a history of this house and how we come to have the Mevlevi dervishes here and what our particular role is within the Mevlevi tradition. And the whole story of Colet begins in about the end of the 19th century, start of the 20th century, with a Russian writer, mathematician and philosopher called P.D. Uspensky. And he was deeply interested in the study of consciousness. And by consciousness he meant the awareness we have behind our thoughts and our feelings and desires. So when you're thinking and feeling, there's something behind that which is aware but your thinking and your feeling. And that basic awareness, or your basic sense of I am, or your basic amness, is universal. It's not individual to you or me. My basic sense of I am is exactly the same as your basic sense of I am, and the sense of I am of the whole universe of 200 billion galaxies or more. So it's like at your deepest identity, we're all one and the same. And so that's what Mr. Ouspensky meant when he refers to consciousness. And in the very early 20th century, he wrote a very bright book, which was called Tertium Organum, and that made him quite famous, and he lived on the royalties from it. And what he was primarily interested in was finding practical methods for accessing that deeper sense of self, so that basic deep sense of amness, which is beyond all trauma. So what he did is he set off on a journey to India, and he went looking to see if he could find schools or methods there. And then the First World War broke out. So then he went back to Moscow and St. Petersburg, where he was called up into the army, but I think he got demobilised due to short-sightedness. And while he was there, he met a very enigmatic Caucasian Greek teacher called G.I. Gurdjieff. And Gurdjieff was teaching this particular system of knowledge. And at first, Ouspensky thought he'd found what he'd been looking for in India in the teaching of Gurdjieff. So he and Gurdjieff studied together for quite a while during the tumultuous times of the First World War and the Russian Revolution. And they were sort of trying to dodge the various different red and white armies that were fighting. And for quite a while they ended up in Constantinople, or Istanbul as it is now. And then Gurdjieff set up a school in France at Fontainebleau, and it was a sort of live-in place, so there were lots of people practicing the teaching. And Ouspensky set up in England, in London, and this school house here became his headquarters in London. And then he had a country house down in Surrey, near Chertsey, a little village called Lyne, and the house was called Lyne Place. And it was like a little sort of replica of the Gurdjieff Institute over at Fontainebleau. And as they progressed, Ouspensky and Gurdjieff's directions parted. The actual reason for the parting causes people a lot of discussion, but from Ouspensky's point of view, he found Gurdjieff's methods way too violent and forceful, so it was almost like taking the kingdom of heaven by storm, whereas Ouspensky was much more interested in gentle systematic methods for accessing that deeper sense of self. So, on the question of what we're not about, we're not a Gurdjieff society. So we're in a direct lineage from Ouspensky, which I'll explain the lineage. And so Ouspensky carried on over in England on his own, and he developed the teaching somewhat, and he wrote more books. He wrote this one, A New Model of the Universe, which is quite good, but it's a bit dated now. Then, after his death, there were books which is well known for In Search of the Miraculous and The Fourth Way, which he never wanted published. They were published by his widow without his permission, because he'd moved way beyond the ideas expressed in those books by the time they were published. But I'll explain that more. So Tertium Organum, A New Model, are fully authorised by him. Tertium Organum I particularly think is brilliant. New Model I think is dated really to the 1920s and 1930s when he wrote it, because science and understanding moves on as time progresses. And again, with any group, each group has its particular story and its particular set of myths. So I'm just telling you the Colet House story, but it's important with any story not to get too caught up in it. It is, after all, just a story. So just enjoy it as a story. So Ouspensky carries on his own, and he goes, during the Second World War, he goes across to America where he continues teaching. And right at the end of his life, in 1947, he comes back to England, and he's a very ill man, and he's dying. And he calls 3 big meetings here in Colet House, in that top studio, where you're doing your training. And it was a very cold winter, apparently, 1947, with snow everywhere. And he announced to this huge group of 300 people that he'd abandoned the system he'd been teaching. And so he abandoned the Gurdjieff teaching. He said, we tried the system and it didn't work. And he prepared one of his main followers, who is a man called Dr. Francis Rolls, privately, on what he was looking for and how to find what he'd been looking for before he met Gurdjieff, which he then latterly regarded as a rather unfortunate detour. So Mr. Ouspensky dies, and then Dr. Rolls carries on with this society, and they gave it the name of the Study Society, which was an abbreviation for the Society for the Study of Normal Psychology. And by normal psychology, it meant but it wasn't a society devoted to pathological psychology. It's a society devoted to what you might call nowadays transpersonal, so it's going beyond the limitations of the individual self into higher states of consciousness. So that's the prime object of the society they set up, was the study of practical methods of consciousness. And another thing just in the Ouspensky story, when he was visiting Istanbul, he made contact with a number of the sheikhs from the Mevlevi Dervish tradition, which was, as you probably all know, is Rumi's tradition from 13th century. And he had a number of dialogues and made a definite contact with the Mevlevi tradition in those times around the First World War, which, as we're going to see, has a great impact on us later on, the connections he made. So, Ouspensky dies 1947, and then Dr. Rolls gradually things scatter at that time. A lot of people of Ouspensky's pupils go back to Gurdjieff, and some go in other directions. And Dr. Rolls carries on with the instructions that Ouspensky had given him. And part of the essence of the teaching that Ouspensky had taught was what he called self-remembering. And by self-remembering, that means recalling that deeper sense of self which lies behind your psyche and behind your thoughts and feelings, and which is ever present, and yet, as we've discussed, is universal. So it's what's looking out through your eyes right now and what's hearing right now. It's not at all remote, it's totally staring you in the face. It's hard to see because it's what's looking out already, and it's hard to look back at what's looking out. So that was basically what self-remembering, the essence of it, was connecting with that, your identity with that deeper sense of self. So Mr. Ouspensky said to Dr. Rolls that because self-remembering is so important, there must be simple methods for accessing it, simple systematic methods. So Dr. Rolls was given the task of trying to find particular methods, and one method in particular, which Uspensky said involved just repeating one word. So during the 1950s, whenever a new teacher came to London, Dr. Rolls and his pals at the Study Society would go off and meet them, and then they'd bring them back to Study Society, and the members would try out the different method to see if it was one that went direct to the source of consciousness. And they had many sort of experiments which ended in disaster. And then the then little known Maharishi Mahesh Yogi from India came over, and he was met by the Study Society members and brought to Colet House. And he had a method of mantra meditation, which became known later as transcendental meditation, and which involves repeating one word mentally until it disappears and you're just left with the present, and then just stillness. And Dr. Rolls recognised that as the method that Mr. Uspensky had asked him to look for back in 1947. But he didn't recognise the Maharishi as the man Dr. Rolls had asked him to look for. So for a while Dr. Rolls studied with the Maharishi, and he went across to India to study in Rishikesh, which is in the sort of foothills of the Himalayas in northern India. And one day the Maharishi announced that the head of his tradition was going to come and visit them. And his tradition is known as the Advaita tradition. And Advaita literally retranslates as not two. So it's what we call non-duality. And so I have to bend Beetle back in history again, because this is making a connection with the whole of the Vedic tradition from India. And so we go right back in history suddenly, about 5,000 years, 3,000 years, when the Indian scriptures known as the Vedas were written. And if you read the Vedas, they're quite mythological. So the gods are mostly to do with the elements. They're sort of Agni, the god of fire, and Indra. So it's very mythological and quite elemental. And that's known as the Vedas. But as the tradition progresses, it becomes known as the Vedanta, which means of the Vedas. And much later on it evolves into what's known as, you get the Upanishads, and you get the Mahabharata, which means the Great War, and the famous Bhagavad Gita is just a conversation from the Mahabharata. And at that point the Vedanta has become fully non-dual, so it's like it's evolved out of the mythological Brahmanism, as it was called, into pure, unadulterated non-duality. So if you read the Upanishads or the Bhagavad Gita or Srimad Bhagavatam, any of those scriptures from that period, it's just it goes into pure non-dualism. So that carried on in India, and what rather happened is it started to become a bit top-heavy. So religion, mysticism rather became the property of the priestly caste, the Brahmins. And as I'll explain later, there are two aspects to consciousness. One is transcendence, so you go into deep meditation and you transcend your thoughts and feelings and you merge with the Absolute. And the other is immanence, where you see that consciousness, the Absolute, is manifesting in everything you perceive in the world around you. So it's both, consciousness is both transcendent and it's immanent, and that's full non-dualism, because it means it's everything. It's not two. There isn't a world here and consciousness there. Consciousness and the world are one and the same thing. So in India, it had become one-sided in that consciousness was perceived as only being transcendent. So back then you had to become a priest or become a full-time yogi and become celibate, and the world was rather sort of spurned and rejected. So in about between the 7th and the 9th century, a great Indian teacher arose called Shankara. Shankara is just another name for Shiva, the Indian god. And Shankara founded what was known as the Advaita school, which is non-dualism. And Advaita, as you probably know, is having quite a resurgence today in popular culture. So with Advaita, it did away with the dualism between the transcendent and the immanent. And it's also at the same time that the Tantra school was founded. And Tantra, again, is about seeing consciousness as both transcendent and in absolutely everything. So you don't have to give up the world, you don't give up your careers, you don't give up your lives. Your life in the world becomes your route to the realization of your true identity. So that was an important shift in Indian culture. And Shankara set up 4 seats of learning. He only lived till about 32. And he put there was a seat in the north of India, and then one in the south, one in the east and the west. And the heads of those traditions became known as Shankaracharya. So they were the heads of the Advaita tradition in India. And the person, now we jump back again to the Maharishi and Dr. Rolls, the person who Dr. Maharishi invited, who was his teacher, was the Shankaracharya of northern India, of Jyoti Math, which is situated in Allahabad. And Dr. Rolls made contact with him, and he recognized that the Shankaracharya was what Mr. Uspensky had asked him to look for, and was a fully realized man and could carry on guiding them. So Dr. Rolls and all of us were accepted as the Shankaracharya's pupils, and he then became our teacher for the next 20 years or so. And so Colet House became totally transformed suddenly with this fully non-dual Advaita teaching starting to take the place of the old Uspensky teaching. And I'll explain more details in another meeting, but Dr. Rolls explained how the old Gurdjieff and Uspensky teaching was what he called bottom-up. So it's like you're a separate entity struggling your way towards consciousness, whereas what we were now learning was what he called a top-down teaching. So it's the realization, but you're not a remote little speck struggling your way up to this distant, exalted state, but you already are everything, but you just don't know it. So that was the big difference. That was the big switch which happened. So that was about 1961 that started. And then in 1963, one of the Colet members had a boy working on her farm, and his uncle was a Mevlevi dervish in Turkey, and he invited some of the Colet members to go out and see the Makabale ceremony in Konya. So again, I'm jumping back in history. Mevlevi, all the way back to 13th century, Jalaluddin Rumi, and how Rumi went into spontaneous whirling, and then his immediate family, his son Sultan Weled, formalised it into the exact ceremony that you're learning at the moment. And that's gone on in Turkey as an unbroken tradition for about 750 years, and the exact ceremony and all the ritual has been passed down in an unbroken lineage. And then again we go back to the First World War, where Turkey sided with the Germans and they were defeated, and the Ottoman Empire broke up, and then Turkey was taken over by its new ruler Kemal Ataturk, and I think he'd been a soldier at Gallipoli, on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and he wanted Turkey to become a modern Western nation. He thought it was too rooted in superstition from the past. And in 1925 he passed an edict banning all fortune tellers and dervishes and everything else he thought was holding Turkey back. So whereas in the past every town virtually had a Mevlevi teke is the place where the dervishes turn, suddenly in 1925 they were all locked up, and if you were caught turning you could go to prison. So what you're doing now you could have been imprisoned for in 1925. So the poor dervishes, suddenly all their tekes were blocked and they had to carry on turning secretly with the curtains drawn, and so no one could see what they were doing. So the whole order had to go underground, as did every other dervish order. And then in the 1950s it started to be allowed again as a tourist attraction, as long as they weren't doing a proper ceremony. And it was started to happen on what we call Shebi Aris, which is coming up next month. It's the 17th of December. It's the anniversary of Rumi's death, and we have a big ceremony here as well. And so this Turkish boy invited some of the Colet members to go over and witness the ceremony in Konya at the time of Shebi Aris. And the sheikh, who was on the skin, the sheikh stands on the red sheepskin during the ceremony, which I'll explain in another meeting, but he noticed the Colet people in the audience, and speaking as the sheikh who does stand on the sheepskin, you can tell exactly where the people are at who are in the audience. You can see exactly who's engaged, who's bored silly, and who's fast asleep. And Mr. Rezavi Bekara, he came from a very long family of Mevlevi sheikhs, and he spotted the Colet people sitting in the audience. And after the ceremony, he talked to them afterwards, and they asked him would he be prepared to come to London and teach the turning ceremony to Dr. Rolls' pupils in this house. And Mr. Rezavi Bekara, he went to ask his sheikh, and his sheikh was a man called Munir Çelebi, and a Çelebi is a direct descendant of Rumi. So Munir Çelebi was Rumi's direct descendant, one of them. And he went away and prayed to Rumi, or Mevlana as we call him, and he came back with the answer to his prayer was, yes, you must go to London and teach for turning. Because what they were worried about was that the ceremony was gradually being changed and distorted in Turkey, and our job, which Mr. Rezavi and Munir Çelebi gave us back then in 1963, was to keep the ceremony exactly as it had been practiced all those years, all 750 years, without distortion. So that's the promise we made for him, and on the basis of that promise he came over here. He was a civil servant and he had 4 weeks holiday, and he trained within those 4 weeks. He came here and trained from scratch 60 people to turn, and the Colet teams, they made all the robes in the 4 weeks, and even people learnt the various prayers like the Samazan Bash's prayer and the Sheikh's prayers. And at the end of 4 weeks they had the ceremony, they gave performance of the whole macabre. He have selected people from the 60 dervishes, and the whole thing was up and running here, and that's gone on as a going concern ever since. And Mr. Ezri made Dr. Rolls, I've already mentioned his picture of him, there he is, he made him the sheikh, and only a sheikh can make other sheikhs. So he appointed Dr. Rolls the sheikh, and he allowed Dr. Rolls to wear this, which is known as the destur, which is the green ribbons of a Mevlevi sheikh. And Dr. Rolls was the first Christian who had ever been granted the privilege of wearing the destur, and it was done because they said of the light in his eyes, and he was my sheikh and my teacher, so I knew him well, and he had a great light and a great warmth, so I loved him dearly. So then you had, each year then we trained, the society trained, would have a new dervish training, and back then they used to do it early in the morning. Somehow, because Mr. Ezri had only had the 4-week holiday, the Colet House people got in the habit of doing it. He used to come in early in the morning about 6 o'clock, and it was, you'd have 6 lessons a week, and you just get Sunday off, so it was like a crash course. And then it got increased. By the time you did it, it was 5 weeks, wasn't it? Yeah. It was 4 weeks when I did it. So at the end of 4 or 5 weeks, you'd learnt the whole ceremony. But later on, with Helen in particular, we changed it more like they actually do it in Turkey, where we have 1 or 2 lessons a week in the evening. Because we've actually found that your bodies assimilate a lot during the intervening week when you're not actually turning. You'll have an absolutely murderous lesson 1 week, and you'll think, what the hell am I doing here? And then the next week you come back dreading it, and say, right, this is definitely the last time I'm coming. And then it's absolute bliss. And it can work vice versa. You'll have an absolutely blissful session, and then you think, oh great, it's nearly time for the next one, and it's murder. So you can't anticipate how it's going to be. So, Dr. Rolls, we've now got in this society, in the context of it, so I want to put the turning in context. It was given to us to look after as a society, and Mr. Ezri and Munir Chalabi were fully aware, but at the time it was an Advaita stroke Uspensky society, and it was based on what is loosely called the fourth way, which just all it means is the way of the householder. So it means that you don't have to go and, as I've said, become a celibate monk. You live your life becomes your route to full realization, and that's different for every person. So in effect, you follow your bliss, you find the thing that makes you really happy in life, and you follow that, and that becomes your pathway. So the next 20 years, Dr. Rolls carried on teaching. So we'd got partly Uspensky, we'd got another set of dances called the movements to music, which came from the Gurdjieff tradition, which are still taught here, which he collected in the Middle East and the Far East and Tibet. So they're taught here. Then we've got the Mevlevi turning, and we've got the Advaita tradition, and we've got part of the Uspensky tradition, which really is like the Western mystical tradition, which has its origins in Neoplatonism. So Dr. Rolls gradually, it became more and more Advaita, more non-dual, as we learnt how to look at things from top down rather than bottom up. And it had been, in Uspensky's time, what was known as an esoteric school, and it was based on the Gurdjieffian model, quite strict and severe. And after the Second World War, especially, of all the people coming out of the services, they actually wanted quite a disciplined society. So for me personally, I was too young back then, but it would have been very scary. But Dr. Rolls brought masses of love into it, and it became much, much looser. Just before he died in 1982, he said to me, I want the Colet House of the future to be a cell of self-knowledge that people can come to for rest and confidence, no longer the image of an esoteric school. So he wanted it to be like a friendly society which has these different methods available, where people can come into it when they need to, and they can just choose which bits of it appeal to them. So if you just want to be a dervish, then you just be a dervish. If you want to do mantra meditation and study Advaita, then you can do that as well, or instead of. Or if you want to do the movements to music, you can do them. So it's like no longer a school, a cell of self-knowledge. And the reason I'm giving the context for it is sometimes people come into the group and they get angry that we're not what they think we should be. So we're not an Islamic Sufi society, though we have lots of Sufis who belong and come and turn with us. We're not a Gajifian society, so we are just what we are, which is a friendly society based on the Advaita non-dual teaching and based on Rumi's non-dual teaching, which in my experience is identical to Advaita. There's no difference at all. And there are even groups here that study Rumi's epic poem, the Masnavi. So there's lots of different things you can dip into if you want to. But one of the principles of this particular way, the way of the householder, is that it's also called the way of understanding. And that means there's no external discipline. Within the practices themselves there's discipline. Helen will soon tell you to put your arms up when they drop down below your waist. But within the discipline, all discipline comes from within. So only you as an individual know what's right for you. As I said at the beginning, I don't know what's right for you. A voice inside yourself will say, I really want to learn to be a Whirling Dervish. Or when you first see the macabre, the same voice might say, no fear, I don't want to do that. So it's listening to that inner voice, and that becomes the driving force that drives you along your particular path and your own pathway to bliss. So Dr. Roll, he died in 1982, and I remember the day he died, I was turning in a macabre. It was a graduation ceremony for a lot of new dervishes, and it was just absolute heaven. I'd turned in the morning training one, and it was absolute murder. I thought I just wanted to get out and get down the staircase, and I was absolutely dreading the evening because it was a huge, great open ceremony with lots of guests. And then it was just absolute heaven. It was like you weren't moving. It was like the whole sort of room was solid love. And then at the end of it, I knew that he must have died, and he had. So it was very good, that. So then we carried on beyond that. So Dr. Rolls dies, and the lovely thing I think about the way it's progressed is we don't have a guru or a leader, because the leader is yourself. The leader is your own true self inside you. So it's when you have someone, a strong external authority figure telling you what to do, you don't get in the habit of listening to the inside of you. When you listen to that inner voice, then you know exactly what to do. So it's progressed along the lines that Dr. Rolls indicated. So it's about 37 years now since he died, and here we all are. And I think it's gone through its ups and downs, but here we all are, and I think it's still extremely blissful, wouldn't you say? Mm. And so recently we became a registered charity, and so even in the dervishes now and again to fulfil our charity function, sometimes there was an event at the South Bank 2 or 3 years ago.
That's how Nina got here.
That's how Nina got here, yeah. I wasn't there, but I think it looked very good on the film. So now and again the Society does sort of external things. And with Macabre, once a month we have a open ceremony when guests can come along and watch it. And that's roughly how the Society has continued. And that's almost the end of my story. Is there anything I've forgotten? So if you've got any questions now, fire away.
Is that Dr. Rose as well in the middle?
That's Mr. Rezavi. That's Rezavi Beykara. He was the Mevlevi Sheikh from Konya. He actually lived in Istanbul. And he was the one who came and taught it to us in 1963.
And the Shev, the one that was directly descendant from...
Munir Chalabi. I don't think I've got his picture just here. I've got it somewhere. It's not here at the moment. He's a lovely man. I didn't meet him, but I met his widow, who was called... what's her name? Halisani. When Mr. Rezavi blessed my sikhi, there's a ceremony called the Blessing of the Sikhis. And when he blessed my sikhi, Halisani was in the background sort of muttering Allah and holding her heart. It was very moving. And if you want it later, after you've graduated, I will do Sikhi blessings just for those who want their Sikhis blessed. And it's part of the Mevlevi tradition. It's almost like your Mevlevi initiation ceremony, but it's completely voluntary. And as Sheikh, you're only a symbol of tradition. So, in a way, you're standing on the skin in place of Rumi, and Rumi is standing there in place of Allah. So it sort of goes back in the causal chain. But because it's a long tradition of 750 years, I think in Sufism they call it baraka, where you get the force of a tradition comes down through the lineage. And I feel it so strongly, often before a Macabre, you get like the whole house just becomes sort of saturated in love and stillness. And I think, where on earth has that come from? It's suddenly like it settles on the building. And that's the baraka. It's the force coming down through the lineage. And the sheikh in the ceremony, as I'll explain later, plays the role of the vehicle for this force that comes down. So the sheikh always remains still on the sheepskin, and the dervishes all turn as part of manifest creation. So the sheikh has to be still and transparent for the baraka to come through into the ceremony. But as we'll discuss later, it's nothing to do with individuals, because all of it is coming from the universal. So all of us are just vehicles. And again, as we'll explain later, all of us are just consciousness, the one consciousness playing all these different roles in the drama. So some of us are playing the roles of the villains, and some people play the roles of the saints, but it's all consciousness playing different roles in this huge, immense movie. And that's really what the Macabre, what you're all learning, symbolises. Any more?
When we decided we were going to do this training, we were asked to answer many questions and to sort of say, did this come from the teacher, that these kind of promises? Or?
It partly did, and it partly came from hard-won experience. So there's always been, within the Mevlevi, in the olden days, they had what was known as a chile, which was before you could become a Whirling Dervish or join the Teke, you had to go on a retreat in the Teke for 1,001 days. And on that retreat you just did menial tasks for 1,001 days. You lived in a little cell or bedded down in the kitchen, and you helped in the kitchen and cleaned the Teke. And at the end of 1,001 days they'd decide then whether you were suitable to be a dervish or a musician. And if you broke your vows or the rules on day 1,000, then you had to go right back to the beginning again and start at the beginning. Now obviously we don't do that anymore, but because it's a very powerful practice, and you'll discover that as time goes on, I can't underestimate or overestimate how powerful it is. We need to know as much about you as possible to see that you suit us and we suit you. I've got 50 years of experience of this practice, and I've seen so many dervishes come and go, and I've seen who it suits and who it doesn't suit, who it's good for and who it's actually not good for. And for instance, with people with too great a level of psychological disturbance, it's often not the best thing. They actually need psychotherapy first. So when we get you to fill in that questionnaire and when we interview you, we're very carefully checking that this is absolutely right for you and that we're going to suit you. If we're not sure about someone, we'll say just come and slow turn for a year, and that gives us a longer time to get to know you. But it's all about finding out whether this is right for you. And at the end of the training, some of you probably won't want to go on and become regular dervishes. You might do it for a few weeks and then you'll probably think, no, I don't really like this. But some of you will think, this is absolutely what I adore and I want to carry on doing this for years. So it's, with the application, we have to know all the medical questions, because it's a fearsomely tough training, as you're discovering, and it gets tougher as you're going to discover. So we have we know the whole training, so we know what you're going to go through. So if someone comes to us with a heart problem and diabetes, we're going to say, sorry, it's not going to suit you. So that's why we have to want you to answer the questions and sign all the waivers and things, because we've got to find out if this is really going to suit you and if you're well enough, fit enough to get through it. So we're being very responsible on our side. And if what it boils down to, and I say this when I'm interviewing, is when you first watch the ceremony, if you watch it and think, wow, I so want to be part of that, then that's it. Because then your determination to do it will pull you through the difficulties of the training. If you watch it and think, oh, I might just give it a whirl, then that's not good enough, because you'll fall out of the training, because you'll never get across the difficulties. So you need that driving force in you, and we'll even make it a bit difficult for you to get on the training, because we have to build up that thing to get you through it. And Helen, as a very skilled teacher, is going to treat each one of you totally individually, and she'll find a way of getting each of you through the training with your own particular abilities, because all of our abilities are different. Because you get some people who just have a body which is made for turning, and it's a sort of doddle, But the ones for whom it's a doddle, they're rarely the ones who stay long term. The ones, in my experience, who really struggle and then have a breakthrough are the ones who it really deeply transforms at a deep level. So we need to know as much as possible to make sure it's right for you. Does that answer it? Anyone else?
Can you say something about the red sheepskin?
Yeah.
Why is it red?
The red sheepskin, I think it's actually a goat skin, someone told me recently. I always thought it was a sheepskin. But it's symbolised red because, one, it links back, I think, to the sacrificial ram in the Bible story. Was it Isaac and Jacob?
Abraham
and Isaac.
Yeah. So you have that symbolic sacrificial redness of the goat skin from the Bible and other traditions, the Quran. And it's also red is the colour of passion and love, and the Mevlevi tradition is really an emotional, what in India they call bhakti. It's a very devotional way. It's not really an academic way for academics. It's a way for lovers. So you become immersed in love. So red is the colour of passion. And then on the day Rumi died in, I think it was 1273, December the 17th, apparently there was this amazing red sunset over Konya. So that again, was there another reason someone explained?
I think the other one was when Shams met Rumi. I think it was also something about the colour of the sky that night.
Wow. So it's got multiple symbolisms.
Yeah.
And in the East, holy men always
Sat on the skin.
sit on an animal skin. So in India you get yogis sit on tiger skins, and in Tibet they sometimes sit on tiger, and dare I say it, snow leopard skins. So it's sort of part of a tradition. Does that answer it?
Thank you.
Any more? I love questions.
Did Dr. Rolls appoint you as the sheikh afterwards?
No, he didn't. I should have mentioned that. The sheikh after Dr. Rolls was Willem Koren. Here he is. He's a Norwegian man. And so after Dr. Rolls, when Dr. Rolls was alive, when I learnt, Dr. Rolls was only doing special ceremonies. And Willem became the second sheikh. So you normally have a first sheikh and a second sheikh. And so Willem was playing the role of sheikh most of the time until Dr. Rolls died in 1982. So Willem was appointed by both Dr. Rolls and Mr. Rezui. And then one day in about 1987, I got a big shock. I was living in a farm in Hampshire when Willem came up to the cottage I was living in and said, Mr. Rezui, and he wanted me to be the next sheikh. And I was totally shocked by that because I thought I was the worst dervish ever. But I actually didn't want to do it because the best job in the whole tekke is being a turner, and I just wanted to be an ordinary turner turning on the floor. So for 25 years I said no to it. And then Willem was getting very old. He was in his 90s and he was clearly dying. And I realised if I didn't do it, the tradition would die out. So I took on the role as first sheikh. So it was nice because I got Mr. Rezui's approval. So it's like a sort of continuation of the lineage. So,
you don't allow to turn anymore if you are a sheikh?
I can turn, yes, I still turn in the practices, but as you'll discover, to keep turning the full makabale, you need to do it pretty regularly to keep up your stamina, or it will become murder. If you do it regularly, it will be bliss. But when you're in your 20s and 30s, I learned it when I was 20, you're full of fitness and you can sort of go away for a few months and then come back and pick it up. Once you get past 40, I'd say, then it becomes harder. You've got to work at it more, you've got to do it more often to keep that level of stamina. Once you're into your 50s and 60s, it's even harder. So I could personally no longer remotely have the stamina to fast turn in a full macabre, but I enjoy turning in the practices, and I did do 30 years turning out on the floor, so I sort of feel I had a fair share of it.
Bliss and murder.
Huh?
Bliss and murder.
Bliss and murder, yes. It's a universe of beauty and terror. From one perspective. From another perspective, it's neither of those. Anyway, so that's Willem. Willem only died 2 years ago? Yeah.
Two or
Yeah.
three.
I became shake about...
Three
Yeah.
next month.
I became shake about 210, 210?
First sheet? I can't remember.
But I've been first shake about 9 years, I think. So Willem, when I became first shake, Willem was ill. I gave him the title of old man shake. So it's like he was there, still a shake, but I was active shake, he was old man shake. So then I can become old man shake.
He used to come and watch the macabre when he was very, very old, Dylan. You remember?
He could be a bit, having known him for years, he could be quite frightening. Fierce, he was a fierce shake. Yeah. I'm not a fierce shake, I don't think. I'm quite a soppy. I'm quite a soppy shake. Willem would sort of he'd sort of bash your arms, and he didn't mince his words.
And Mr. Razui used to chase you around the room with a stick.
Yeah. Willem sort of based his method on Mr. Razui's method. So if you think Helen's scary, it's nothing. She's just a pussycat as well. But as pupils, you have to be a little scared of her, because she has to push you to your potential. So in the pupil-teacher role, there has to be respect for the teacher in order that she can do her job of getting you through it. But you can trust her because she's going to look after each of you in a very individual way. Any more questions? I love questions.
I have one. In our practice, when we take the seal position, when we cover like the right toe,
Yeah.
is it also linked with one part of ourselves taking over the other part, or something with the left brain, like left side of the brain?
There are several. Yeah, I know your question. There are several reasons for the symbolism. One's to do with someone getting their toe burnt, isn't it?
The seal position of the one toe over the other, yes. And I'll tell you the story of that
Later on.
weeks.
But the sort of basic symbolism of that and this is it's sealed because it's almost like you're dead without the breath of God passing through you. So what it indicates is that you're a vehicle for consciousness. So when you're sealed, Rumi uses the analogy of a ney flute, which is the flute that they play in the ceremony, and how it's dead until it's blown into with the breath of God. So it's like you as a vehicle, your mind-body, becomes a transparent vehicle for the light of consciousness. So as you're going to learn fairly soon, you open up, then you're opening up as a channel for the universal. So that's really the basic symbolism of the sealed position and of all of this. I'll explain more when I do the ceremonial about looking into the heart. But it's telling you that of yourself, you're not the doer, as they call it in Advaita, but you are the vehicle for the one mind or the one consciousness. So that's like all the things, we'll come on to it, everything in the ceremony has significance, and it's all like the whole of the teaching, the non-dual teaching, is contained within the symbolism of the ceremony. But that bit just tells you that you are a vehicle.
Will we be taught this mantra that is taught as part of the Advaita practice here?
If any of you are interested in that, when Mr. Rezavi came here to teach, he had certain Mevlevi mantras and methods, and he said to us, I'm not going to teach you those because you've already got your own method. If anyone wants to know more about that, then there's a lovely lady in Colet called Sylvia, who you'll meet if you haven't already met her. She's very blissful, and she looks after that whole sort of area of it, the meditation. So whereas I was given the turning to look after, she was given the meditation tradition. So if anyone wants to know more about that, then I'd put you in touch with her to have a chat with her.
Is she the lady that introduces the Mahabharata?
No, that's Annie Branston. Annie Branston's a sort of big elderly lady,
Yeah.
92 or 3.
92.
92.
Wow.
And she just, as a byword, she studied with one of Uspensky's pupils in the 1940s called Maurice Nicoll, and Maurice Nicoll had studied both with Gurdjieff and Uspensky. He was a psychiatrist who studied under Jung, and he had a school a bit like Uspensky's, and he was authorised to teach by Uspensky. And then when Maurice Nicoll died, he said to his pupils, they'd been studying basically the Gurdjieff teaching, he said, we've had a lovely party, but we're not to continue because there's something much better coming. And then he died. So Annie Branston went off and came here and sought out Dr. Rolls, whereas most of the rest of his pupils went off to Gurdjieff, which was interesting. So Annie heard very clearly what Dr. Nicoll had said just before he died. So I love Annie. I've known her 50 years, and she has a deep sort of inner bliss inside her. She's very still, and it oozes out of her, and it always has
Oh my
done.
God, it super oozes out.
Yeah.
Every time I see her, I'm like,
Yeah, it absolutely oozes out of her.
it's just
And she learned
Amazing.
with Mr. Razui in 63.
Yeah, she did.
She was in the first year of Mr. Razui's teaching.
So she's our oldest
She's our oldest dervish.
And I remember her turning. She was a lovely turner. Her arms never got very high, but she always looked really happy. So in the ceremony, in what Helen's teaching you, though you try to do your best, very few people get an absolutely perfect posture, and that's absolutely fine because a lot of our bodies won't physically go into that. Not everyone's made that way. So do your best, but don't do your best is enough. Don't think you're like me and think you're the worst turner ever, but you're just exactly as you're meant to be. Any more? If there's no more, yeah.
Last question. In this tradition, do the dervishes have a way of greeting each other?
Again, if we'll explain in the same, when you meet on the street, you can greet anyone how you want. You can say hi or hey, or yo, bro. In the ceremony, as you'll see when the dervishes bow across the skin, you look into the eyes of the dervish and you see the light of the beloved in the other person. and then you bow to that. So you're bowing to the one mind, which is exactly the same as who you are, across the skin in the other person. And the word makabele means coming face to face. So that's exactly what that represents. You're acknowledging the light of God looking back at you in the other person. And again, that's very blissful, because it's often like sort of love ripples down the line across that, the bowing across the red skin. But when you greet them on the street, you can say what you like.
Permission and go on to share some memories. I'll just bring it.
Okay. Yes, indeed. Yeah.
Everyone stays up.
Yeah, this is the moment. I think I'll turn this off now.